Welcome. Thank you for being here, everyone. And yeah, just so everyone knows, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel and sent out to all registered participants. So before we begin tonight's workshop, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Be More Beautiful. We're a city-led peer-to-peer beautification program. Our goal is to not only change behaviors and attitudes towards the beautification of our city, but also to encourage residents, businesses, and organizations to become directly involved in activities and projects that keep their neighborhoods clean. Um, so to meet this goal, we work closely with neighborhoods on their unique beautification projects and cleanliness challenges, as well as provide educational literature, outreach materials, workshops, and other resources residents can use to keep Baltimore beautiful. So if you're interested in learning more about our organization, I'll be putting a link to our website in the chat in a bit. Um, so yeah, just before we get started, I'll just go over a few housekeeping things. So if you have any questions while our speaker is presenting, please put them in the chat. Does that sound okay to you, Michael, or do you prefer
Yeah,
to have people?
that's fine, yeah.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. So put them in the chat or save them for the end. This presentation, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, will be about an hour.
For 45 minutes, yes. Yeah.
Cool, 45 minutes. And then we'll do like a question and answer session after. So while our speaker is presenting, please remember to mute your microphones. Um, and yeah, so tonight we'll be learning from Michael Andorsky. Michael is a retired pediatrician, Baltimore City Master Gardener, and co-chairman of Pollen, the Pollinator Initiative Committee of the Baltimore City Master Gardeners. Master Gardeners are a statewide program of the University of Maryland Extension Service. Its mission is to train gardeners in the science of gardening and have them use their skills to educate their local communities. Baltimore City Master Gardeners promote good gardening practices throughout Baltimore City. Michael has also studied bees as a volunteer for the U.S. Geological Survey in Beltsville, Maryland. These interests have led him to address the threats facing pollinators, including bees and butterflies, by lecturing on pollinator and gardening issues to schools and community groups. Among its many services and educational activities, um, the Pollinator Committee of the Baltimore City Master Gardeners helps to install pollinator gardens throughout Baltimore City. And thank you so much for being here, Michael, and I will now hand it over to you.
Okay, hi, good evening, everybody. So we had trouble last time I tried to give this talk with Zoom, but thank goodness everything seems to be working out, and I think gardening is easier for me than technology. Um, so, you said, great. There we go. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to plant a pollinator garden. And to begin with, we got to ask ourselves, why do we plant pollinator gardens? And the answers that we're going to come up with are two reasons. One, it's good for the pollinators, and secondly, it's something beautiful for human eyes. And then we got to talk about location. Can you grow pollinator gardens in the shade? How much sun do you need? And so forth. And then we're going to talk about what do you need to do to prepare the bed before you put the pollinator garden in. And then likewise, after you prepare the bed, which plants are available for pollinator gardens? And then what do you do with the plants? How do you design the plants? So the way you design them, it turns out, is important not only for us and the beauty of a pollinator garden that we see, but it's important for the bees and the butterflies that visit it. Then we're going to talk about how do you maintain this beautiful garden that you've put together. What do you need for that? And so to start out with, the main why of the pollinator garden is cross-pollination. So cross-pollination is when pollen from the stamens of one flower, and I've put up here a dime in all the pollen to show you how small it is. It's just like dust. So when the pollen from the stamen of one flower goes all into the pistil, makes its way down into the ovary of the flower, and the male gamete, the pollen, meets the ova of the pistil. Together they form a seed for the next generation of flowers. And that is the chief reason for why we put pollinator gardens in, to get the next generation of flowers. Without pollinators, this would not be possible. Ta-da. Actually, I should say that the cross-pollination is done by the female bees, as indicated by this picture. Butterflies and other pollinators aren't picky, but as far as the bee is concerned, only the ladies are the ones that do the pollinating. So, what are some of the pollinators? Well, the bees that we all know about. The bees are the most important pollinators. Not only are they the most important and prolific, but it turns out that except for one genus of butterfly, the only animals that actually need the pollen for themselves are the bees. They use it for their embryos as food. So the pollen is important for the bee as well as for the flower to which it transfers the pollen. And we have butterflies or pollinators we see in our gardens, and hummingbirds. There are two different kinds of hummingbirds in the Maryland area. And even before the bees came to this earth 130 million years ago, we had the beetles, who were pollinators, and ants are pollinators, and bats are pollinators. Not so much in Maryland, but in other parts of the country, bats do a lot of pollinating as well. So all of these are pollinators. Bees are probably the most important pollinator in terms of the number of plants that get pollinated, the number of species of bees that are able to do that. So the next thing is, where do you put your pollinator garden? So you have to look for a good location. So this is an example of a bad location. It's too much shade. In general, you want about 6 hours of sun for a pollinator garden. There are many pollinator plants that will grow in partial shade, but if you want the most variety, you want at least 6 hours of sun. And you want it usually facing south. It could be the southeast, southwest, or due south, because that's where usually you get most of the sun from, unless you're living in a yard where there's a big house or trees are blocking the property in such a way that you have to have it face a different way. But if you can have it face south, southerly, that's the way to do it. And you want it, if you have a windy spot, you want it away from the prevailing wind, because the butterflies and the bees have a tough time staying on the plants if it's very windy. So how do you prepare the soil? Well, you can do it the way the fellow on the left is doing. You can dig up the turf, or you can do it the way it's shown on the right, and you can smother the soil. If you smother it, you have to start it earlier. You have to start it in the winter, so it has at least 3 months to get ready for the spring. And after you've smothered it, it looks like this. And once it is all smothered, you can either move it out by hand, or you can rototill everything in the way this fellow is doing. And that's the way you prepare the beds. What about using Roundup to prepare a bed? We think that Roundup is not a good idea. And it's not a good idea as shown by this picture. The people that produce Roundup tell people that are going to be using a lot of it to dress like this. Because the glycophosphate, the Roundup, you need eye protection, a respirator with a replaceable filter, rubber gloves, and cotton overalls, because there's some evidence that Roundup may cause various cancers. There's no definite evidence in humans yet, but there is a lot of evidence in cows that eat a lot of the grasses that Roundup is important. So don't use Roundup. The other way to do this is to make a lasagna garden. So a lasagna garden, you start at the bottom here with layer 1, which is cardboard or several layers of newspaper that are soaked in water, and you keep alternating green layers and brown layers. Green layers of peat moss or manure or vegetable scraps and so forth. Brown layers of shredded leaves in the fall or hay, and things that are not green, and you keep alternating the green and the brown, the green and the brown, until you get to the final layer on the top, That's, you put compost or manure in that, and as you see these fellows on the right, they're planting right into that. And as the years go on, everything underneath it becomes compost as well. So this is a very good way to do things, except it takes a long time to get that layer of compost up. But this is another possibility. Or you can use raised beds and buy soil. If you're going to buy soil or make your own soil, you want to use about a third topsoil and a third coarse sand or peat and a third compost. And you mix that together, and that makes a very rich soil for a raised bed. And you can buy this combination already prepared. If you want to test the soil you're going to use yourself, you can do it with a soil test, of course, but native plants are pretty adaptable to most kinds of soil as long as it's not all clay or all sand. So you can do a ribbon test. So a ribbon test is you take a ball of the soil in your yard and you put it in your fist and you squeeze it to make a ribbon. So if you can get a clay ribbon, a ribbon that's more than 2 inches long, you have too much clay in your soil. It should be less than 2 inches long. Or if you have soil that's mostly sand and you squeeze it, you can't get any ribbon at all. So you want ribbon, but it needs to be less than 2 inches. And that's a quick and easy test to see that you have soil that in fact is going to be appropriate. Soil that has a ribbon that's less than 2 inches long. And whatever soil you have, the first time you put your garden in, it's a good idea to add about 2 inches of compost to the top. The alternative is just to add a shovelful of compost each planting hole, but the best way is to add 2 inches at the top, and then you don't have to worry about filling in the planting hole. So to figure it out, you could just use a simple arithmetic, length and width times 2/12, which is 2 inches, 2/12 of a foot, gives you a 2-inch layer. Or if you have a round garden, use pi r squared, 3.14 times the radius squared times the height of the soil you want, of the compost you want, which is 2/12 of a foot. And that gives you your answer as to how much compost you need to buy. So the question is, the first question we have should be, what do the pollinators want in the garden? So the first thing they want is 75% native plants. So what's a native plant? A native plant is a plant that's been here before the Pilgrims. The idea is that if the plant has been here for a very long time, the native bees and butterflies have had a chance to adapt to it and are more likely to go to it. So there are some bees that'll go to almost any plant with pollen, such as apis, honeybees. But there are other bees that are very picky and only go to a few different plants. So you want 75 native plants so you can reach as many different kinds of native bees and butterflies as possible. The other 25%, you can use various non-native plants that are also good for some pollinators and also make a garden easy to grow. Then you want to plant in variety and drifts. A variety because one type of bee likes one type of plant and another likes another kind of plant, and in drifts because bees and butterflies have very much like to stay with one kind of plant at a time. So if you have one kind of plant that's spread off all over the garden, the bees are less likely to efficiently get to the pollen of those plants than they are if you plant in drifts, meaning groups of at least 3 plants. Then you want a constant bloom, something that goes up from the early spring into the late fall. So there's something available for the pollinators all during that time. And also you want to use, if possible, living mulch. At least you want to avoid hardwood mulch. And you want to avoid hardwood mulch because the bees, the native bees that burrow into the ground to form their nests can't get through hardwood mulch. It's okay to use pine mulch. It's okay to use hay, but the very best thing is living mulch, which is really just low-growing plants. And those low-growing plants act as a weed barrier for your garden. And we'll talk more about that later. So, are there any plants you do not want to plant? And the answer is yes. You don't want to plant plants with double petals, meaning plants that have no pistils or stamens that you can see. So here's a dahlia, and the pistil and stamens are hidden until these plants are almost ready to die near the end of the season. Here's impatiens, no pistil or stamens are visible here, and likewise roses. However, here are dahlias, impatiens, and roses, all of whom are a variety that are okay to plant because you can see the stamens and the pistils. So stay away from plants where you can't see the pistils and stamens. Now, this next part of the talk, please don't take notes on this because you're going to be given handouts that Morgan has that list all the different native plants and lists when they bloom. Is it early spring, mid-spring, summer, or fall, as well as their heights. So it's easy to design a garden using them. But I want to show you this just to show you that there is a huge variety of plants available to you now. So these are native perennials. These are the early ones. Here's wild indigo, which bees love. This is a bombus, a bumblebee going after them. And this is ragwort, which is an early plant that looks like sunflower, but comes up very early. And here's wild geranium, which is a very nice ground cover because when the flower goes away, it fills in all of the area so you don't get any weeds. And here we go with bees after that. This is a mason bee. Here are Virginia bluebells and spiderworts, which are also an early native perennial. These are all coming up in the early spring. Then there are the mid-season perennials, such as Asclepias tuberosa, which is ragweed, which all of the Asclepias plants, as you may know, are necessary for monarch butterflies because their caterpillars feed on them. So this is a very pretty one, Asclepias tuberosa. And here's some monarch butterflies feeding on them right here. More caterpillars. And then also Monarda comes up in mid-season, which at least in my yard is a very good plant because the deer don't like it, but that's not true in every yard with all deer. And then there's Pacanthamum. This is called mountain mint, which is not an especially beautiful plant, although it makes a nice filler if you cut it for a bouquet. But it's a very important plant because it is the highest nectar plant of any plant. So most pollinators love this plant. Here are some more mid-season native perennials. This is yarrow. And this one shows several. This is rudbeckia over here. And echinacea is in the back over here, and agastache. All of these are mid-season. And then in the late native perennials, the ones that come out in the fall are New England aster and goldenrod. So these are all native perennials, and then there are enough here that will last you for the entire season from spring to fall. Here's some more late perennials, thoroughwort and Joe Pyeweed, which actually starts blooming in July, so it's a little bit, it's fully bloomed in the late season, but it's there earlier as well. Now we're talking about some non-native perennials. These are good to plant as the 25% of plants that are not native, including globe thistle and gaillardia. This is butterfly bush. What about butterfly bush? That sounds like a great plant to plant, but it's not, because butterfly bush is a plant that is an invasive and it's not native. However, having said that, there's some recent hybrids that have come out of that are called butterfly bush, which are not invasive, and it will say that when you buy the plant, it will say not invasive. Then on the right are daisies, which are not native perennials, but there are many different kinds of bees go to them. Here is sedum. And now they have a bunch of annuals, which many of the bees like, including cardinal vine on the left and cosmos on the right, nicotinia, nasturtium, lantana, zinnia is one of my favorites, and most bees like that a great deal. Pentas, these are all annuals, so this is part of the 25% of your non-native plants. In addition, you can plant from bulbs, which usually come up in the spring. Glory of the snow, snowdrops, aconite, allium, crocuses, hyacinths, water lily tulips are all fine for pollinator gardens. Here's some more: muscari, squill, bluebell, and anemone. These are not native, but they can be put as part of your 25% plants in the garden. Then there are various forage herbs that are especially good for pollinator gardens because the caterpillars of butterflies like them, including parsley and dill and fennel. These are great plants for pollinator gardens. Other herbs are borage, which is a nice herb because we don't eat it, so we allow it to flower. If you grow other herbs that we do eat, you can pick some for yourself to eat, but you have to leave a bunch for the bees to get to as well. And then there's pineapple sage, which is also an herb. So there's quite a variety. Now, when we talk about living mulch, we're talking about low ground covers. So creeping phlox and thyme and pussyfoot and sweet woodruff. Sweet woodruff is not a native, but it's a very good ground cover, and it spreads, and this is good to use instead of mulch. Now, often people will put in their main plants the first year, and they will gradually add on some of these plants the next year to save a little bit of money all at once, but other people prefer to put everything in at once. We'll talk about that later. You can also use grasses in a pollinator garden. This is little blue stem. This is a bottle brush sedge, and this is blue-eyed grass. All of these are fine for pollinator gardens, as well as lemongrass and muley grass, which are higher, and sometimes give a lot of interest to put one of these occasionally into a garden. So that's a briefly, and don't write this down because we have the handouts that show them all the plants that are available. So then the question is, how to put the plants in the garden, what order to use? Well, you can use what the wife is saying here, which is, how are you arranging new plants by color? So that's not such a hot idea. So what is the husband's idea? Alphabetical order. I've never tried that before, but I don't think that would work as well. So we're going to talk about how to do it, not by color and not by alphabetical order. The first thing about a pollinator garden that's helpful is something that's not a plant. It's a focal point. So here, this old bench is a focal point. It's something that draws the eye to the center or back of the garden. Here's another example of a focal point: a walkway that goes down the middle of a garden, or even a tree, which is a plant, but in the center of a garden is very well. Of course, the only problem with this is it blocks out the sun when it's fully in bloom, and so it's not going to be very helpful to some of the plants because it gives them too much shade. Or you can put something artificial in, such as these little statuettes, or even a bird bath. All of these are good focal points. Then you need a theme. A theme is a plant that goes from one end of the garden and draws your eye all the way to the other end of the garden. So to use an example here, this is a theme which starts out, and you have all of these plants, these plants on one side, which are just yellow, but they all have a big center to them. Black-eyed Susans, and then it moves into these plants that are the echinacea, the cone flowers, also big centers, and then it moves into the daisies, also big centers. So all these plants have something in common, they have these big centers, and they draw your eye from one side to the other side. So that's an example of a theme. Here's another example. If you look at this plant, there's white plants here, white plants here, white plants there. Your eye is drawn by the white. That's the theme of this garden. What's the theme of this garden? Well, the theme of this garden are the grasses. There's a big clump of grass here, there's a clump of grass here, and then there's a clump of grass off screen here in the foreground. And these three clumps of grasses form the theme for this garden. So that's the theme. Now it comes to design. How do you design the garden? So you start off with a piece of graph paper. And this is marked off so each box is a half foot. So if you have a rectangular garden, that's your garden. Then you got to put a theme in the garden. So you decide, okay, I'm going to put a flower or something, or different kinds of flowers that have something in common all the way through the garden. So you put where you want your theme in the garden, like so. And then you put in the other patches of plants. Here, 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 and here, and here. Now you have to decide what to put. The reason for putting them in patches is you want them in large drifts. You want them, a bunch of the same plants together, same plants together, same plants together, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now you're ready to put some flowers in. So here's an example. So the verbena is in the front, and then there's some echinacea, some coneflower over here, and helianthus is over here, and then so the short ones are the, if you have a rectangular garden and it's going to be viewed from one side, you put the short plants in the front, you put the tall ones in the back, and you put the theme somewhere in the middle, like this. Okay? And then each of these other plants is a focus for the plant, whether it's one of the things we talked about, a chair or a piece of artwork. Put that somewhere in the middle of the garden. Then you put the plants in. So these plants, all of the major plants that you put in are 2 feet apart. Okay? If you want to put in a ground cover at the same time, you put them in between. So the ground covers are 2 feet apart also, but the main plants. Okay, here's another example of a small garden. So over here, this F plant, this white indigo, is for part of the year, there's a tall plant, is the focal point. And then when this stops blooming, this Joe Pye weed blooms, and that's because they're the tallest. So garden, I think the intention was to make the A plants the theme. So there's 3, there's the butterfly milkweed, which is orange, and then there's these other plants, these fall sunflower, which is orangish yellow. So your eye is covered by the orange yellow going all the way across. So that's the idea of a theme there. Okay, here's a garden layout. So where's the focus and where's the theme here? So this has a plant as its focus. It's a hydrangea. And the reason the hydrangea is the focus is it tends to be, it's the biggest, bushiest plant that's here in the garden, so it stands out. So where's the theme? So here is, there are 4 pillars in the back, and that acts as the theme for this garden. So you have the focus, you have your theme, and you have all the plants that are within the garden. So if you look at this other possibility, and I think the person who put this garden together put the grasses in, lemongrass, muley grass, all the way across, lemon, muley, 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 to draw your eye from one side to the other. That's the theme. Okay, here's an example. These are the grasses that I just showed you, lemongrass and muley. So you can see they're quite tall. They're about 2 to 4 feet tall. So they form a nice theme for a garden. All right, here's another pollinated garden. So where's the focus in this garden? Well, the focus on this garden is something that's not seen by at least 2 of the people that are sitting in the garden. The focus is the people who are sitting are sitting in their chairs in the garden on this little patio. That's the focus. And where's the theme? Well, one theme could be these the witch hazel and the button bush, which are taller bushes, or the theme could be all these willows and abelias and blueberries that are in the back, which are shorter bushes. But one way or the other, your eye is drawn from one side of the garden to the other, one side of the garden to the other, and that's why it's a theme. All right, how about this garden? So in this garden, where's the focus? The focus is the chair. And this garden actually has several possible themes. So one is this little trail that goes up along here. I guess you can call this a focus rather than a theme, because they're not plants. So that's another focus. And the themes could be, the first theme could be all of these plants, which are of light color, which look like, I guess it's supposed to be Monarda. Or, and it goes all the way around. Or this chamomile and parsley that goes all the way around, like this. Or the rosemary that goes all the way around. So this garden has a lot of themes because it's very symmetrical, but it really works. So now you have the garden in the ground. You have the soil was properly prepared. The plants are put in an order that makes a lot of sense. So what do you do about treating the soil that you have? Do you need any of these things? Do you need gypsum? Well, let's start with the fish extract. Do you need fish extract fertilizer? The answer is no. Do you need mulch? No. Do you need blood and bone meal? No. Do you need gypsum? No. The only thing you need is 2 inches of compost, or alternatively, a shovel full of compost in each plant hole. Compost, that's it. And you only put it in the first year you put the garden in. After that, the garden is on its own. But you have to water the garden for the first 2 years, at least 2 to 3 times a week if there's no rain. So this fellow is very attentive. You don't have to be quite so attentive as he is. If the day needs an umbrella, you don't need a garden, or you can do what I do, which is if there's no call for rain and I go out and water the garden, if I water my garden, it's almost certain to rain that evening. So one way or the other will get rain. Okay, what about weeding? I do not have any good methods for you to weed. Goats sound like they might be a good idea, except that they're not particular enough, unfortunately. And using mechanical means to weed, unfortunately, mows down the good plants with the bad. So you're back to the old-fashioned way of weeding, hand picking the weeds, or putting lots of low-lying plants in that protect against the weeds. But even if you do that, you're going to have lots of weeds. So there you go for the weeding. All right, so now the summer comes and everything is coming up in your garden. What do you have to do? Well, you need to prune and deadhead. Some of the bushes get too big and scraggly. They need to be pruned. Flowers should be deadheaded when the flower goes away, especially things like coreopsis, because coreopsis will continue to bloom all summer if you keep deadheading it. Likewise, Monarda will come back again if you deadhead it when you get the first bunch of flowers off. So pruning and deadheading is about all the things you need to do in the summer. But you don't want to go a little bit crazy like this guy and over prune so things look a little too artificial. You want them to look as natural as possible. All right, so now you come to late autumn, and what do? Do you leave everything up in the ground or do you cut it back? So this fellow is very happy with himself because he's not going to go out and do all the work of cutting down the garden again. He's just going to leave it up, which shows that not only is he a sophisticated gardener, but he does less gardening. The reason for leaving the garden up is that insects have a place to live in all of the stems. But many of us, myself included, want to cut at least part of this back. So I cut the garden back to about 6 to 12 inches, which is good for 2 reasons. Number one, it lets me know where the plants will be the following spring. And number two, it gives enough stem for them, for plenty of insects to find a living home for the winter. And now we're hitting the button and nothing is happening. Okay, let me back it up here. Up here. Okay. So the following spring, you're out in the garden again, but your garden is in place, but you probably will add some flowers to it that you hadn't before. And you'll find some of your native pollinators have spread, and you can lift them up and you can move them around to other parts of your garden. And a few years later, when you get so many, you don't know what to do with them, you can give them to your neighbors. And that also helps because you'll be starting a pollinator garden in someone else's yard. So we have several handouts, and Morgan has a couple of these which she can give to you. And in addition, if I see you at an upcoming event that we're going to be having, I have some other handouts. So there's one handout which is basically a review of everything we talked about in this 45-minute lecture. And we have other handouts too. The native perennials for pollinators Morgan has. There are annuals for pollinators. There's a handout on soil prep, about how to add 2 inches of compost to the garden, how to space the plants, and a list of Maryland nurseries that sell native plants. But over recent years, since native plants become so popular, you can really find native plants in most nurseries now. So with a little bit of work and a little bit of watering and a little bit of garden design on your kitchen table, you too can end up with a garden that looks like this. And that's the end of the talk. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. And let me go to the chat box here. Let's see if there are any questions here that need to be answered. Live in Alabama. Love watching the pollinators. Good for you. I'm from Alabama too. Nature is awesome. I've advanced in composting and vermicomposting. Hi, happy gardeners. Okay, no questions yet. Let's see if there's any more going down here. I think that's it. I see butterflies just about every time in the garden. I wasn't aware. Okay, I see butterflies just about every time I'm in the garden. I wasn't aware that certain plants attracted them. The answer is yes, certain plants attract them. And that's A. And B, you need to have milkweed in order to get the next generation of butterflies. But C, I'm glad to hear you have lots of butterflies in your garden because we've been getting fewer and fewer over the last several years in Maryland. And the reason is that the butterflies can't all make it up from the south and they die in the Midwest. And the reason they die in the Midwest is that the farmers are trying to get rid of the milkweed, which for them is a weed, get it out of their crops. And they're using insecticide, rather herbicide, to get rid of all the weeds, but unfortunately it gets rid of the milkweed, so it gets rid of the monarch butterflies as well. But if you keep planting plants here, at least we'll get a few of them. Let's see. Next question was, I've seen a total of 3 butterflies all summer long in my Baltimore garden, despite my best efforts, like planting delectable dill or caterpillars, lots of birds and many different types of bees. Has anyone had the same experience? Well, yeah, I just told you that I basically had a similar experience, and a lot of it is due to what goes on in the Midwest. And the only way we can combat that, of course, is to give butterflies a good home for the ones that finally get all the way to Maryland. Okay, I think that was all the comments that were questions here. So I'm going to turn this over to Morgan now, and you can handle any other questions you'd like. Okay.
Yeah, there's I think a few more in the chat. I see one from
Oh,
Stephanie. What kind of pollinating do ants
oh,
and
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Thank you. I didn't get down that far. Okay, yes, no white butterflies in the past few years. We talked about that. Okay, again, if you want butterflies, there are different species of butterflies. They go to several different plants, and if you have a wide varied garden, that's the best way to attract them. But in order to get the next generation of butterflies, you need to have milkweed. So make sure and have milkweed. There are three kinds of milkweed that you can get in Maryland. Um, and the tuberosa I showed you, which is very pretty and it's orange, the Syriaca, which is the common milkweed, and the swamp milkweed. So, and they're all highly available. What kind of pollinating do ants do and to what plants? Okay, ants will pollinate most plants, and there are certain plants that they love to pollinate, which are the peonies. So when I bring the peonies into my house, some of them for cutting to put on the table, I have to make sure and soak them first to unfortunately get rid of all the ants, but there are plenty of ants left out in the garden. What native plants are good for containers? All right, that's a very good question, and I have a whole lecture about that actually. But the bottom line is that if you plant a plant in a container, the difficulty with the container is overwintering the container. And the second difficulty is there's less soil in the container than there is in your garden. So some plants have very deep roots, such as Asclepias tuberosa, for example. And the plants with the deepest roots do not pollinate well. That's problem number one. Problem number two is keeping the plants going over the winter. So these plants, because they depend upon their roots being deep, often will not survive Maryland winters. So you need to either put bubble wrap around your planters or pick up the planters and put them in a garage or shed for the winter, but get them out of the wind and get them out of the cold. Having said that, people have tried many different kinds of natives, and they will not keep coming back year after year, but they may come back for a few years. The best plants that are the most reliable are the ones that are either bulbs or the ones that are non-natives that are good for lots of the bees and the butterflies, such as cosmos and zinnias. You mentioned a commercial pre-made mix of topsoil, peat, and compost. Yeah, if you just go and you tell them you want soil for your container garden or soil for your raised beds, they already have it mixed up. Where am I now? Let's see if I can get any lower here. Great presentation, very thorough with great suggestions and resources. Thank you all. That's from me. That's from Tony A. Thank you, Tony. Okay, I think that was the last one on there. So, Morgan, I'm turning this over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, all of the handouts that Michael mentioned, I put a link in the chat. I'm just gonna put that again in there. So I think I have the majority of the ones that you mentioned, Michael. I know I have native perennials, handout how to design a pollinator garden, and then the soil preparation for pollinator gardens one. So yeah, the rest of them feel free to send them to me and I'll get them sent out to the rest.
Stephanie had a question. Just so here's another question. Stephanie's question was, my tomato plants are not flowering. Do you have any advice? Okay. So I have a vegetable garden also, Stephanie. So the thing about tomato plants is, number one, they usually self-pollinate. So it's important if you have to have more than one tomato plant. You have to have at least two or three so they can pollinate each other. That's number one. Number two is that if you plant native plants, pollinator plants, in your vegetable garden, between your vegetables, the vegetables will grow better. And there was a very interesting study that was done about this in England several years ago. Some English farmers had these huge blueberry farms, and they noticed that their acres of blueberry farms, that the blueberries on the edges of the acreage near the woods grew better than the blueberries in the center where there was no other plants except blueberries. So they decided maybe the pollinators like to go after the blueberries that were already there because of the other plants. So they decided to plant native plants in between the rows of the blueberries. And what do you know? The following year, their blueberry harvest increased. So plant pollinator plants in your vegetable garden along with your vegetables. Okay, Morgan, are you still there?
Yes, I think so. There's one more question. Do I need multiple elderberry and blueberry plants to make fruit? If yes, same variety or different?
Say, read the question one more time, please.
Sure. Jackie was asking, do I need multiple elderberry and blueberry plants to make fruit? If yes,
All
same
right.
variety or different?
Okay, so it's I'm not an expert on vegetables, and I'm not an expert on most of the plants except pollinator plants. But it's true that there are some plants, such as winterberry, for example, that not only do you have to have more than one plant, but you have to have a male winterberry plant and a female winterberry plant. So when you go to the nursery, you can get advice as to that. So the answer is yes, some plants you need to have not only more than one plant, but specifically the plant has to be male or female. That's not true for all plants, but it's true for some, such as winterberry. Okay? Okay.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, does anyone have any other questions? And feel free to unmute yourself too if you want to just hop in the conversation. Okay.
Do you want
Well,
to mention that garden tour we're going to be doing?
yes, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if there's no more questions, we'll wrap up. So for those of you who are local to Baltimore or Maryland, Um, we are having a pollinator garden tour led by the one and only Michael next week, next Wednesday, July 31st at 6:30 p.m. In Sherwood Gardens. I'll be sending out all of the information about how you can join that. I'll send like the address and all of that. There is another page to register for it, but you don't
And
have to.
also,
You'll do.
Morgan has a map, so once you get to Sherwood Gardens, you can find our pollinator garden.
Yes, and I will send that out as well. So yeah, we invite you all to come to that if you want to see a pollinator garden in action, get to experience the fruits and the flowers and the pollinators all doing their thing. And Sherwood Gardens is just beautiful too. So we hope to see you all there. And yeah, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for the folks who came out after the last Zoom where there was like, yeah, some technical difficulties. So we really appreciate you all attending tonight. And yeah,
Okay.
see you all later. Thank
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
you. And thank you, Michael.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh, bye.